The drive up into the deep woods of the Catskill Mountains was supposed to be a much-needed reset for my girlfriend, Emma, and me. After a grueling year of 60-hour work weeks in the city, we dropped a ridiculous amount of money on a weekend rental that the listing described as an ultra-modern, secluded glass and timber sanctuary. The photos online were stunning: massive floor-to-ceiling windows, wrap-around wooden decks, and absolutely zero neighbors for miles in any direction. We arrived just as the sun was dipping below the dense pine canopy, casting long, jagged shadows across the gravel driveway. The house was magnificent from the outside, a sprawling, angular structure built directly into the side of a steep hill. But as I pulled our SUV up to the front steps, I couldn't shake a weird sense of disproportion. For a house that looked like a sprawling modern fortress from the outside, the listed square footage on the app had seemed surprisingly small. I chalked it up to thick insulation and strange, modern architectural choices. The host, a guy named Thomas, whose profile picture was just a generic photo of a pine tree, had left the keys in a digital lockbox on the front porch. We let ourselves in, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind us with a solid, echoing thud. The interior was pristine, decorated with minimalist furniture, thick faux fur rugs, and massive, wall-to-wall mirrors in almost every room to make the space feel larger. But the strange disproportion I had noticed outside was even more obvious inside. The hallways felt unnaturally narrow. The ceilings in the living room were vaulted and grand, but the master bedroom felt strangely claustrophobic, boxed in by thick, heavy walls. "It's beautiful," Emma said, dropping her weekend bag on the pristine white duvet of the master bed. "But doesn't it feel a little tight in here? Like the layout is missing something?" "It's probably just the design," I replied, trying to be the voice of reason as I unpacked my duffel bag. "It gets freezing up here in the winter, so they probably built the walls extra thick to keep the heat in. Plus, look at the bathroom." I pointed to the ensuite bathroom, which was entirely dominated by an enormous floor-to-ceiling mirror that covered the entire wall behind the double vanity. It reflected the bedroom perfectly, creating a flawless illusion of endless space. We opened a bottle of wine, cooked dinner, and tried to settle into the absolute silence of the mountains. By 11 p.m., the deep, suffocating darkness of the remote woods had completely swallowed the house. The massive windows that looked so beautiful in the daylight now just felt like giant black screens, exposing us to whatever might be lurking in the tree line. Feeling a sudden primal chill, we retreated to the master bedroom, making sure to pull the heavy blackout curtains completely shut. We turned off the bedside lamps, plunging the room into total darkness. I was hovering right on the edge of sleep, the wine pulling me under when I heard it. It wasn't the normal sound of a wooden house settling in the cold, or the wind rustling the pine branches outside. It was a soft, deliberate, rhythmic sound coming from directly behind our headboard. I lay perfectly still, my eyes wide open in the dark, my heart suddenly thumping against my ribs. Screech. Pause. Screech. It was faint, but unmistakable. It sounded exactly like the slow, deliberate drag of human fingernails sliding down the inside of the drywall. And then, right after the scratching stopped, I heard the heavy, muffled sound of someone taking a deep breath. "Did you hear that?" Emma's whisper was so quiet it barely cut through the darkness of the room, but the tremor in her voice told me she was wide awake. She shifted closer to me, her hand gripping my forearm like a vice. "Yeah," I breathed, my eyes darting around the pitch-black bedroom trying to pinpoint the source. "It's probably just mice or raccoons. We're in the middle of the woods, Em. Old cabins have critters in the walls all the time." "That didn't sound like a mouse," she whispered back, pulling the duvet up to her chin. "It sounded heavy, like a person." I sat up, the cold air of the room hitting my bare chest. The rational part of my brain was working overtime, trying to dismiss the visceral dread settling in my stomach. I reached over and flicked on the bedside lamp, bathing the room in a warm, yellow glow. The scratching had stopped completely the exact second the light clicked on. It was as if whatever was making the noise was reacting to our movements. "I'll go check it out," I said, trying to sound much braver than I felt. It might just be a tree branch scraping against the siding outside. I slid out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor, and grabbed the heavy metal flashlight from my duffel bag. I walked around the massive king-sized bed and pressed my ear directly against the drywall right behind our headboard. I held my breath, listening intently. There was no scratching, no breathing, just a strange, hollow draft. The wall was freezing to the touch, much colder than it should have been for an interior partition. "See? Nothing," I lied, offering Emma a reassuring smile that felt entirely forced. "I'm going to grab a glass of water and check the thermostat. Be right back." I left the bedroom and stepped into the narrow hallway. The absolute silence of the house was oppressive. I checked the front door. The deadbolt was firmly locked. I checked the massive living room windows. Nothing outside but the black void of the forest. I walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of tap water, trying to shake the paranoid feeling that I was being watched. I turned back toward the master bedroom, but as I passed the guest bathroom in the hallway, I stopped. The door was slightly ajar, and a freezing gust of air was pouring out from the dark room, sweeping across my ankles. I pushed the door open and clicked on my flashlight. The guest bathroom was small, windowless, and dominated by another one of those massive wall-to-wall mirrors above the sink. I stepped inside, shivering in the sudden drop in temperature. I reached out to check the air vent, thinking the AC was malfunctioning, but the vent was completely still. The draft wasn't coming from the ceiling. I slowly lowered my hand and moved closer to the sink. The freezing air was seeping out from the tiny seams around the edges of the massive mirror. I leaned in close, my nose almost touching the cold glass, staring at my own pale, terrified reflection. Why would there be a draft behind a mirror that was supposedly glued to a solid exterior wall? My heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I remembered a trick I had seen in a spy movie once. I raised my hand and pressed the tip of my index finger directly against the glass. In a normal mirror, there is a tiny gap between your physical finger and the reflection, caused by the layer of glass sitting on top of the silver backing. But here, in this isolated cabin in the woods, my fingertip touched its reflection perfectly, point to point, zero gap. It was a two-way mirror. The air vanished from my lungs. I raised the heavy metal flashlight and gently tapped the base of it against the drywall next to the mirror. Thud, thud, solid wood and gypsum. Then I moved the flashlight and tapped the center of the mirror. Clack, clack. It sounded entirely hollow, echoing into a large, empty space right behind the glass. Before I could back away, before I could even process the horrifying reality of what I was looking at, a sound came from the other side of the glass. From the pitch-black void directly behind the two-way mirror, a knuckle slowly and deliberately tapped back. Tap, tap. The sound of the tap against the hollow glass echoed in the small bathroom, freezing the blood in my veins. My primal instinct screamed at me to smash the mirror with the heavy flashlight, to confront whatever degenerate was hiding in the dark crawlspace. But reason, cold, terrifying reason, held me back. We were miles from the nearest town, the cell service was practically non-existent, and whoever was in the walls knew the layout of this maze intimately. If I attacked, we would be fighting a ghost in its own haunted house. I had to play dumb. I had to pretend I was just a clueless tourist getting a glass of water. I forced my hand to reach down and turn on the sink faucet, letting the water run for a few seconds. I splashed some cold water on my face, deliberately avoiding making eye contact with my own reflection, terrified that if I looked too closely, I would see the silhouette of a face staring back at me through the silver tint. I turned the faucet off, walked out of the bathroom, and closed the door behind me. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to walk at a casual, unhurried pace back to the master bedroom. As soon as I crossed the threshold, I gently closed the bedroom door. Emma was sitting up in bed looking anxious. "What took so long?" she whispered. "Did you find out what was making that noise?" I didn't answer verbally. I put my finger to my lips in a desperate shh motion. My eyes darted toward the massive floor-to-ceiling mirror covering the wall of the ensuite bathroom. If the guest bathroom mirror was fake, this massive piece of glass was undoubtedly the main viewing screen. Whoever was in the walls had a front row seat to our bed. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, turned the brightness all the way down, and quickly typed out a note in large font. I handed the phone to Emma. "Do not look at the mirror. There is someone living inside the walls. The mirrors are two-way glass. We are being watched right now. Put your shoes on. We are leaving immediately." I watched the blood drain entirely from Emma's face as she read the words. Her eyes went wide with pure, unfiltered terror, and she instinctively started to turn her head toward the bathroom. I grabbed her chin gently but firmly, forcing her to look only at me. I nodded silently, pleading with her to hold it together. She swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes, but she nodded back. We moved with agonizing slowness, slipping out of the bed and grabbing our shoes. We didn't bother packing the bags or folding our clothes. We just grabbed our car keys, wallets, and jackets. I kept myself positioned between Emma and the large mirror, trying to block the viewing angle as much as possible, my hand white-knuckling the heavy metal flashlight. We slipped out of the master bedroom and into the narrow hallway. As we walked toward the living room, the bizarre architecture of the cabin finally made horrific sense. The walls weren't thick for insulation. They were hollow corridors, a hidden perimeter built completely around the living space. Every room was a stage, and the host was the audience. As we tiptoed past the guest bathroom, I heard a soft, scuffling sound coming from inside the drywall, tracking our exact movements down the hall. He knew we were leaving. We reached the massive living room. The front door was just 20 feet away. "Just keep walking," I whispered to Emma, pointing the flashlight toward the exit. We made it to the heavy oak door. I reached out, grabbed the brass deadbolt and twisted it to unlock. But the knob wouldn't turn. It was completely rigid. I tried the handle. Locked. I pulled frantically, but the door wouldn't budge a millimeter. Then, a small digital screen mounted above the handle that I had assumed was a thermostat suddenly beeped. The screen lit up bright red, displaying a single word: locked. The host had engaged a smart home security override from his phone. We were trapped. Before I could even process that we were sealed inside, the cabin plunged into absolute darkness. The main breaker had been cut. And from the far, dark corner of the living room, a section of the wooden bookshelf swung open with a soft, mechanical click. Footsteps stepped out onto the hardwood floor. The soft, heavy footsteps on the hardwood floor sounded like thunder in the pitch-black living room. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. I shoved Emma behind me, raised the heavy metal flashlight like a club, and flicked the switch to its highest setting. The blinding beam of LED light cut through the darkness, hitting the intruder dead center. It was Thomas, but he looked nothing like a generic host. He was wearing a filthy gray tracksuit, his face pale and gaunt from living in the dark, windowless crawl spaces of the house. Around his neck hung a pair of heavy night vision goggles, and in his right hand, he held a long, serrated hunting knife. He raised his free hand to shield his eyes from the harsh beam of my flashlight, hissing like a cornered animal. "You ruined the show," he snarled, his voice raspy and unhinged. "You weren't supposed to leave the bedroom yet." He lunged forward, swinging the serrated blade in a wide, vicious arc. I shoved Emma backward, narrowly dodging the knife as it sliced through the fabric of my jacket. Adrenaline completely took over. I didn't back away. I stepped into his guard and swung the heavy, solid steel base of the flashlight with every ounce of strength I had, aiming straight for his head. There was a sickening crunch as the metal connected with his jaw. Thomas let out a gargled cry, stumbling backward and dropping the knife. He crashed into the glass coffee table, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. "The window!" I screamed to Emma, realizing the electronic deadbolt on the front door was still completely locked out by his smart home system. I grabbed a heavy, solid oak dining chair by the legs, spun around, and hurled it with blinding force at the massive floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the driveway. The thick glass held for a fraction of a second before exploding outward in a shower of glittering shards, letting the freezing mountain air rush into the cabin. I grabbed Emma's hand and we scrambled through the broken window frame, the jagged edges tearing at our jeans. We hit the wooden deck, slipped on the frost, and practically tumbled down the stairs toward our SUV. I hit the unlock button on my key fob, threw open the passenger door for Emma, and dove into the driver's seat. As I jammed the key into the ignition and the engine roared to life, I looked up at the shattered window of the cabin. Thomas was standing there in the darkness, illuminated only by my headlights. He wasn't chasing us anymore. He was just standing amidst the broken glass, lifting a digital camera to his eye, recording our escape. I slammed the car into reverse, tires spinning wildly on the gravel, and tore out of the driveway, flying down the winding mountain road at 60 miles per hour until we finally found a pocket of cell service. When the state police raided the property 3 hours later, Thomas was gone. But what they found hidden in the architecture of the house made national news. The entire cabin was a custom-built voyeur's maze. Behind every mirror, every air vent, and every painting were narrow, soundproofed hallways equipped with tripods, microphones, and hidden cameras. In the basement, police uncovered a massive server bank containing thousands of hours of highly organized, high-definition footage of hundreds of unsuspecting couples who had rented the romantic, secluded getaway over the past 4 years. They never caught Thomas. The property was registered under a web of fake LLCs, and the host profile was scrubbed from the internet hours after we escaped. I still have nightmares about that cabin. But the most terrifying part isn't the memory of the man with the knife in the dark. It's the knowledge that somewhere out there on the dark web there is a video of Emma and me sleeping, recorded by a man standing mere inches away, separated only by a thin sheet of two-way glass.